12-minute question section. We acknowledge, of course, the Gadigal people as the traditional owners of this land, and we pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Matt Condon, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Metcalfe Auditorium today for this chat with a dear friend and a great writer, Michael Robotham. Again, more housekeeping, just bear with me. As you will have already seen, we're following COVID protocols, of course. We're all double vaxxed. We've all checked in with our QR codes. We should keep our masks on, except when eating and drinking, you know that. Or in the case of the speakers, when we're on stage, we can leave them off, right? Social distancing means there are restricted numbers in the room. Please try and respect the protocols. Hand sanitizer is available at the door, and please let a volunteer know if you feel unwell. That's very important. Just wave your quivering hand. Please mute your mobile phones and don't record the session, please. And if you're taking photos, turn off the flash. Feel free to share all of this fun and frivolity on social media at Bad Crime Sydney or hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. We'll have questions, of course, and with our Zoom friends, they'll join us later. So, phew, Michael Robotham, welcome. How are you?
Good. Are you going to introduce yourself?
I have introduced myself. I'm very modest. I stay. My job here is to facilitate, Michael, and to probe you.
Did he introduce himself?
I did. I'm up. Yes, I'm the little elf up there in the poster. Yeah. Look, I think, you know, Michael, we've been crime reporters. Our friendship goes back, I shudder to think, 30 plus years. And we've been journalists, and I'm still a journalist. So transparency is very important, right? And we're only meters from Macquarie Street, from Parliament House. So we're imbued with transparency in Macquarie Street in Sydney, very much so. So it's expected of us. So, and, you know, I think it's an important quality, transparency, Michael. So we've known each other for a very long time. And I got nostalgic preparing this. And I thought, let's reach all the way back in time to see if I can find some early Robotham journalism.
Oh, no.
And blow me down if I didn't find a couple of interesting little pieces. This is not embarrassing, Michael. This is actually quite flattering. So I found a piece. It was published on a Sunday, so I'm assuming the Sun Herald.
Yeah, maybe.
April 5, 1987.
No, that would have been the Sunday Telly.
The Sunday Telly.
Yeah, I had a little stint with, I went over to the dark side and worked for Mr. Murdoch for about 7 months.
Did you?
Between my trips to London.
Oh, that may explain the quality of this piece. But so in this piece, you're writing about a group of 12-year-old Liverpool soccer fans in the UK, right? Is it coming back to you?
No.
And well, I'll quote it directly for you. Amid the swirling red and white flags, they display the rosettes of past victories like war medals on their skinny chests. The chant is, here we go, here we go, here we go again. Such is the dominance of the men from Merseyside. These terrace choir boys are not much displaying devotion as stating a fact of life. Isn't that sweet? I think that's really nicely written, actually. I was just making fun of you. It's a lovely vignette, and I can feel, I'm not making fun of you now, Michael, please. I can feel a novelist's eye there flexing. That's a beautiful color, description. It's not overwrought.
At least, yeah, it's interesting. At least you didn't, you know, my mother kept my first example of writing, and it was a poem, and it began, it was about the Indian Pacific, the train, and it began, the Indian Pacific from Perth to Sydney, oh, my aching kidney. Oh, come on, you try to rhyme something with Sydney.
I thought you were going to say it started clickety-clack, clickety-clack.
But no, it's funny. I think it's interesting that piece was 87 because I think I learned, I went to London. I started in journalism in 1979 on the Sydney Sun. And I went to London in 1985 and spent was working there as a feature writer for the Mail on Sunday when I came back. I had to wait for a work visa to be arranged, so I had to leave Britain for so many months while that was being processed. But I learned a tremendous amount writing with some of the most amazing newspaper feature writers that I got a chance to work with. And I think that is a reflection of that sort of paragraph is the sort of thing I was trying so desperately to mimic how they wrote. They just seemed to write so beautifully. And I felt as though I was doing a very poor imitation most of the time.
Now, I learned something about you. I've known you for so long, and I never knew this until literally 5 days ago in an interview I read with you, where you, in fact, wrote the draft of a novel set in Australia in, quote, a little fishing village when you were 25 years old. I never knew that you'd actually written a full novel.
Yeah, it's called God's Waiting Room, and it's rumored to be the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel.
It's rumored.
Yeah, and it's funny, and obviously
where that came from. That rumor.
And obviously, and every time I mention it, I have publishers, including my own, saying, "Oh, we'd very much like to read that novel," and I think to myself, well, while it stays in my bottom drawer, it will always remain the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel. And once I pull it out, all bets are off.
Do you go back? Have you looked at it?
Yeah, I looked at it a few years ago. It's funny, it was almost published in 1985. It was almost published. And this sort of reflects on to a degree on the books I write now. It was submitted by a UK agent, my agent, and Penguin. It got to the final publishing meeting at Penguin, and I'd missed out by a single vote for them to pick it up and publish it. And I remember afterwards asking the question, why? What did it need to do? And they said that if you had written that novel and set it in England, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, we would have published in a heartbeat. This is in the UK, this publishing meeting, by the way. But because you set it in Australia, it was a little bit too hard for us to try to market or sell. And this was 1985. So the world has moved on a hell of a lot since then. But in 1985, it was very hard for a novel set in Australia to get a UK publication in the UK. But that was in the back of my mind when I began to write another novel, which became The Suspect. And again, I was still in the UK and I had UK sort of management. I thought I'll set the next one in the UK because maybe that will mean I can get it published. And of course, that book triggered a bidding war, and that was the beginning of my career. But if it hadn't been for that rejection of that unpublished novel, I don't think I would have set a book in the UK, my publishing career could have been quite different.
So was it set in Coffs Harbour?
It was actually, because I grew up in Coffs Harbour my high school years, and it was set in a Coffs Harbour. When I first arrived in Coffs Harbour, it was still quite a small town, and it became for the 10 years that I lived there, it was the fastest growing town in Australia. It sort of ballooned in population from sort of 10,000 people to 60,000 people in 10 years. So the developers moved in, and anyone that sort of knows Coffs Harbour, you'll know the development and the high rise, and and it was so you saw this very small fishing community altered, and in a sense, it was a novel set against that backdrop.
That phone call actually was Penguin. They want to make an offer on God's Waiting Room. Yeah, I just find that fascinating. You actually had the crack at that. And if that had been published, might you still be writing novels set in Australia?
Quite possibly. And that wasn't discernibly what you call a crime novel either. It was there was a sort of mystery associated with it. But yeah, it was, I know it sounds, this is not my description, by the way. This is what my agent pitched it to Penguin as a cross between Rain Man and Of Mice and Men. Only an agent could come up with a pitch like that. But that was the way it was pitched at Penguin.
Might maybe it deserves to stay at the bottom drawer, Michael. I'm not sure. You've talked a lot, of course, in the past, and people that love your work know that you were a ghostwriter for many, many years and certainly cut your teeth writing. How many did you end up writing?
I did 15.
15, that's enormous. But you said something recently in an interview that I'd never thought of, and that what you took from ghostwriting was the innate ability to get inside the skin of a character and see through their eyes. I mean, I think it didn't occur to me, or I thought about that of course, that would be one of the biggest parts of the ghostwriting job, would it not?
Completely. I mean, if you imagine of the people that I did in the book, all the people that I'm allowed to talk about, whether it be sort of Lulu or Jerry Halliwell or Tony Bullimore or, for my sins, Rolf Harris. But if you imagine, your job as a ghostwriter is to write the book in their voice, in the first person, and to do it, if you do it perfectly, people that have known them their entire lives will not recognize your fingerprints on the story. It will look and sound and feel exactly like them. And it is the absolute job. I mean, you as a journalist, I know, I'm sure in the past you've had to, you've commissioned some politician or someone to write a commentary piece or a think piece, and you get it in and it's complete garbage, or they dictate it over the phone and you have to fashion it into some sort. But in a sense, you're trying to, in a sense, mirror or mimic their voice to make it sound like something they would write. But ghostwriting is the ultimate job of doing that, where you spend, I mean, I used to joke that, if you spend so much time doing it, you spend months interviewing them, spend months transcribing, you spend months writing, and when you have their voice in your head, when the publishers come back to you, editors come back and say, listen, can we have a bit more of this scene? You don't actually need to consult them. You know what they're going to say. You can write it in their voice. And I remember joking, and, I could have, it's not so much of capturing the voice eventually, it's getting the voice out of your head. Once you finish that book and have to start a new project, how you get rid of that other voice. Because I could have written War and Peace and made it sound like Jerry Halliwell. I mean, her voice was just all consuming, and you'd spent a year writing nothing but capturing that in her voice. And then you'd have to turn around and you had someone new.
I mean, you'd have to some degree, partially like the character, wouldn't you? Wouldn't want to spend a year in the head of someone that you detest.
No, and in most cases I did like them. And look, I had no idea what was to come with Rolf, but I knew with Rolf, I knew though that there was something quite dark about the man, because he was almost pathologically depressed, and it only emerged later when all that, when the shitstorm broke about what he'd been doing, that the fact that his daughter wouldn't speak to me for the book, and the fact that his wife wouldn't speak to me for the book, and all the time I'm thinking, what's happened here? That there's something as big has happened here, but I wasn't a party to any of that. And even in the penultimate chapter, when he said something, or it's written something like, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making things right with my wife and daughter. And I thought that was because he spent 40 years touring the world, being away from them for months at a time, and giving himself to everyone else other than them, that that's what he was trying to make up. In fact, what he was saying was he had some very big, dark secrets that were about to come out, and he was going to have to do a lot to win them back. But yeah, no, it's you meet them. It's funny when you have to like them in a sense. It's a bit of a beauty parade when you meet someone. I mean, look, people may have heard, and I've told you this story. It's when I first met Jerry Halliwell. She just fled the Spice Girls. She was being chased around the world by the paparazzi. I had no desire to do the book. I had a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old who listened to Spice Girls music endlessly. I thought, she's 25 years old. What on earth has she got to say? It's just, I don't want to do it. I'd never done a pop star. I'd never done a celebrity. I'd always done politicians or adventurers or soldiers. I'd done those sorts of big SAS books. And I was instructed that I was just told, just go and meet her, just meet her, you know, and then you're going to be one of 6 writers she meets, you know, and I flew to LA, and she was hiding out at George Michael's house in Coldwater Canyon. I got to the gates, and the paparazzi were camped out front. I managed to get that through the outer gate, and inside the inner gate, Jerry answered the door wearing itsy bitsy yellow bikini, which is not the reason that I did the book. But within about 20 minutes of meeting her, I assumed that she would lie to me. I assumed that all people in her position were just into image management. She would tell me a whole pack of lies about what she wanted the world to think she was. But within about 20 minutes, I could have sold what she told me for probably £750,000, you know, in terms of the abuse, the sex, the drugs, and I was blown away. I actually felt protective of her. I thought, my God, if she's going to be dishonest, someone needs to protect her, you know, and also what an astonishing opportunity to tell a story about someone who sang into a hairbrush dreaming of being Madonna, who came from her mother cleaned toilets at a shopping mall. Her father had not worked in her entire life. She sang into a hairbrush dreaming of being Madonna, and she finished up being one of the most famous women in the world, but was anorexic, bulimic, and had never been more unhappy in her life. And it was that idea of be careful what you wish for, that sort of fractured fairy tale of wishing for fame. And I thought, that is a book I want to write. You know, and so I liked her. I liked her a lot. I liked that Jerry a lot. Within 12 months, when her solo career had started, and she had 4 number ones, and she was surrounded by people that just told her how wonderful she was, and her head had got bigger and bigger and bigger, she became someone I liked a lot less. But I really liked that vulnerable Jerry that I first met, the really honest one. I liked a lot.
Do you stay in touch with these people?
Yeah, a lot of them I do. Obviously, some of them I don't. It's funny. I had a falling out with Jerry, which is sad because my daughter, Alex, my eldest child, is a singer, songwriter, producer now, and she's in LA, a very successful one. But she still has signed Jerry Halliwell stuff up on the walls of a studio because the Spice Girls were the most important sort of figures in her life. And when she broke into the music scene in a big way, she sort of wanted me to let Jerry know. And I reached out to Jerry hoping that I could communicate with her again. But we'd sort of had a falling out. I refused to write extra chapters for her book, particularly because at that point she was almost on the verge of going back into hospital and being treated for anorexia. And she wanted to write chapters about her miracle makeover and why she looked so great. And yet I had a mother begging me, please, please get her to eat. And I just thought, I'm not going to be a party to convincing a whole lot of young women, or convincing that one young woman in particular, that what she was doing was healthy. And so I walked away from the project, and she got very cross and sort of cut me off. But it was, but I liked her a lot in those early days.
So having learned how to get inside people's skin, how did you translate that skill, do you think, across to your fiction?
I think it's a reason that I've written almost every novel in the first person. You know, it became, and it's not a usual form for crime novels, first person narratives. I mean, it's often very hard to tell a twisty story when everything has to happen within the sight or in the hearing of your main character. It's a very difficult thing to write a thriller or a whodunit in that sort of situation. But I'm just very comfortable writing in the first person. And in a sense, all it was there came a moment when I'm sure it's the same with, I mean, you write amazing fiction and non-fiction, but when you write your fiction, when you create your characters, there comes a moment when you think you know that character, you understand that character, you inhabit that character's skin. And I found that when I was ghostwriting, you'd have all this thousands of words or hours of transcripts, and you'd write a paragraph and you'd say, that's not the voice. That's not the voice. No, that. And you'd keep trying until you'd suddenly think, that's the voice. And I always remember when I wrote the very first novel, Joe O'Loughlin novel, this, brilliant psychologist suffering from Parkinson's, just diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the opening line that I wrote, and it was the line that I knew that I had his voice, was when he said, when I wake up in the morning and I reach down, when I wake up in the morning, if I can reach down and tie my shoes, I know it's going to be a good day. And I thought, that's his voice, that slightly self-deprecating sense of the absurd and humor. And I thought, and so I treated much the same. Once I have the voice, I'm fine. But so much of it is, can I find that voice?
I was fascinated to read too about the book that, obviously did it all for you, The Suspect, how you'd written a 117-page sort of chunk, and your agent, I think, called you the reluctant thriller writer, because your objective straight off the bat wasn't to be a thriller writer, but you'd written this section that publishers had got very excited about.
Yeah, but it wasn't really a book. I mean, there wasn't really a body in that first 117 pages. I didn't know it was a crime novel. I don't plot, it was only, it was only after the book was finished that people would ask me, why do you write crime? And I'd go, well, I don't know. I said, well, you wrote a thriller. I'm going, yeah, I just wrote a story where it was more, I suppose I was aiming more for that Hitchcockian sort of man caught at the wrong time, the wrong place, sort of story, But as you know, I mean, all great fiction involves conflict, and sometimes that conflict is a crime, or sometimes it's a mystery or whatever. I didn't know I was becoming a crime writer, to the point where, this was a book that sold into 21 languages in 3 hours at the London Book Fair, and there were multiple book deals. And when I sat down to write another novel, I had this idea for a romance. and my agent said, no, you can't. I said, why not? I said, because you're a crime writer. And I said, since when? I said, read your contract. And there in the contract, it said, you will write something of similar vein or in similar nature, and that shocked me to begin with. I didn't think that I was signing up. I mean, I love the genre, don't get me wrong. Now, particularly the things I can explore, the social issues I can explore, the darker reaches of the human psyche that I can explore. I mean, I think it's, I love doing what I do, but at the time, I didn't realize that I was becoming a crime writer.
But did you read in the genre at that time, or was it what?
No.
No.
I mean, do you remember Jim Hall, the former literary editor of The Australian? My very first ever interview with Jim, and the headline read, "The crime writer who's only read one crime novel." And that's just it. I tried to tell him that I'd read one of each, that I had read, a Raymond Chandler, and I had read, an Agatha Christie. And somehow Jim got that confused that I'd only read one. And it's haunted me that, because either I get asked which one, because either it's got to be the best crime novel ever written or the worst one, because why would you just give up after one? And so I didn't know where I go in the world, I will get that question saying, which was the book you read? And
God's waiting room.
And normally Val McDermott will go, it was mine,
But you read a lot of Ray Bradbury when you were a kid. There's a great story about Ray Bradbury and his influence on you.
Yeah, there is. No, I mean, I do love, and some of you may have heard me mention this story before, because I did talk to Richard Fidler about it. But no, I wrote a story about, it must be 7 or 8 years ago now, and I told the story that when I was 11 years old, I wrote a letter to Ray Bradbury. I'd read Ray Bradbury. I discovered him when I was very young. I was living in Gundagai, of all places, and there were 3 or 4 Bradbury titles you couldn't get in Australia. So I wrote him a letter to just Ray Bradbury, Random House, New York, and I don't recall putting a stamp on the envelope. And I came home from school about 3 months later, and there was a package on the kitchen table containing the 3 books that weren't available, and along with a letter from Ray Bradbury, saying how thrilled he was to have this young reader on the far side of the world. And I wrote that story up about 7 years ago now for an American magazine, and I quoted Bradbury, who once said that Jules Verne was his literary father, and Mary Shelley was his literary mother, and Edgar Allan Poe was the batwing cousin they kept locked in the attic. And I said that Bradbury was my literary father, and that Steinbeck and Hemingway were my overachieving older brothers. And the story appeared, and a week later, I got an email from Alexandra Bradbury, Ray's youngest daughter. I had no idea that Ray was still alive. I'm sure many of you know who he is. I mean, Fahrenheit 451 is the most famous title, of course, but he's a remarkable short story writer. And Alexandra said, we discovered the story you wrote, and I read it to my father. He's now 91 years old. He is now completely blind, but I read it to him, and I wanted you to know that you made an old man cry, and he wanted you to know that you are his son, which is just remarkable. And sadly, he died before I could get to meet him. I was due to meet him in LA, and he died about 4 weeks before I arrived. But he was a huge influence on me. I mean, again, he was just a beautiful, clever storyteller.
When you did make the transition, I mean, you would have published millions of words of journalism, the ghost-written books. Then you come to fiction. Did you find that bridge difficult or confusing, or did you just fall right into it?
I don't know. I mean, I honestly thought I'd talked about being a writer since I was 12, because Ray Bradbury sort of inspired me. And I was making a really good living as a ghostwriter. I mean, back, until all these journalists lost their jobs, and now they're so desperate for work, there's no money in ghostwriting because they'll do it for beer money. But back in the day, it was seriously lucrative if you did a big ghostwriter, a big celebrities book, you made far more money than I'd ever seen in journalism. And so I honestly was between projects. I'd finished Rolf Harris's book, and I'd been commissioned to do Lulu, the 60s pop star. And I had a 3-month window when I wrote 117 pages of The Suspect. And I honestly thought my only ambition was, I'll get it published, it'll sell 12 copies, Mum will buy most of them, and I'll just go back to ghostwriting. That's making me a living. I've got a mortgage, I've got children, I have to pay the bills, and I just thought there's no money, and at the moment, now's not the time for me to eat oranges in a freezing garret and sort of channel Hemingway. And of course, the bidding war changed my life. I mean, that suddenly in the space of 3 hours, every dream I'd ever had of being a full-time writer came true. And then the terror set in, because then I suddenly thought, oh my God, these people think I know how to finish a book, But I must admit, I thought fiction would be easier, because I mean, you deal with ghostwriting and you're dealing with one of the things I discovered after doing 15 books for people is they tend to be quite mercurial people. And by that, I mean, they can be very difficult people. They might be likable, but they are difficult. And that's sometimes the reason they have become incredibly famous, is because they are just single-minded, or they're stubborn, or whatever. And I suddenly thought, writing just for me, that's going to be easy. I mean, I don't have to deal with the egos. I just got to worry about my own, But I tell you, a good day ghostwriting, you could write 5,000 words because all the material's in front of you. It's like when you do all your research, for your nonfiction books. I mean, when it's all in front of you, you can write quickly. But when you're inventing it from nothing in your head, that's a lot harder. You must find that.
I do, but having said that, you would have amongst your readers, you couldn't make a factual error in one of your books. Readers are usually right on top of you so fast. I remember my novel I wrote many years ago, The Trout Opera, and I got a letter from a lady that said, on page 394, you mentioned a specific antimacassar that's on the back of this chair in this homestead. in Dalgety. And I'd just like you to know that that type of antimacassar wasn't made until, 45 years later or something. And I'm going, you can't get away with anything, can you?
I think on the first novel, I think I said that Joe O'Loughlin's great-great-great-great-grandfather was a founding member of the British Medical Council. And someone emailed me and said they must have been only 14, and so someone had done the math on that, and but the worst ones are the gun nuts. If you put firearms material, if you put mention guns at all, you will get this diatribe saying, what sort of idiot thinks that a 22 bullet can travel that distance and can do that damage to a body? You must be a complete imbecile. And it's just nothing but diatribe. And then there's always a PS at the end saying, should you require any future advice on firearms, feel free to call.
But in your new book, for example, and we've got Philomena, and she's a member of the London Metropolitan Police. So you've got descriptions of uniforms, and you've got to get that all right, haven't you?
Yeah, you do. And I was and look, it's I'm sure you're the same. The journalist in us means we have to get it as right as we can, and so all of my books are set in real life places, and I will have walked the streets. I'll have done the research, and you still get it wrong. You can still even. The world changes so quickly. You'll suddenly find, literally 2 months after you set something in a building, that building was bulldozed, and suddenly you got people letting you know that building doesn't exist anymore. Or you face the opposite problem where you get lawyers contacting you saying from your publisher going, that house you describe on that corner with that colored roof and that tree in the front garden, is that a real house? Yes. Well, you've got to change it. Why? Because you put 2 bodies in their front room and someone lives there, And so it's sort of, you've got to be exact, but you can't be too exact. But yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky, but it's interesting with Philomena in this book because it is about police, London Metropolitan Police, and it's not a police procedural as such. It's just set in that world of the police. She's a young policewoman who, I guess basically the setup is she rescues a young woman from a domestic violence situation. Young woman's called Tempe Brown. Turns out that the abuser is a decorated London detective, and she arrests him because he doesn't just attack this poor woman, but he attacks Philomena. And that case is hushed up because he powers that be in London Metropolitan Police. He's too important a figure for it to be made public, but she's made a sort of powerful enemy. And that idea of police corruption, so a lot of the procedural stuff that I describe is true, but then I had to tell the police that were advising me, eventually I'm going to have to break away because simply the story, it doesn't lend, having a 6-month break while there's a police inquiry is not going to help my story flow. I have to speed things up. And it's like when you read or you all know, if you watch a courtroom drama on TV or you read about in a novel, that's a very stylistic version of what a real court case is like, because anyone that's sat through a real court case knows it's as boring as batshit most of the time, and there are long delays, and you don't get to hear just wonderful speeches and wonderful cross-examinations. They are just such a tiny part of real life. But what we do in novels is we speed that up and we stylize that sort of thing.
With your initial trigger ideas, I mean, you must get many, but do you scope around you? Do you pick little newspaper clippings? Where does it all start to assemble?
All of that, really. I think. I mean, for When You Were Mine, there were two. Well, I mean, the main thing was that it was an ABC report. I think it was 7:30 report of about 18 months ago about the police failing to investigate domestic violence or domestic abuse cases when it involved other officers. And there were interviews with some women and partners of police officers who had suffered horrendously, because where do you turn if your abuser is a police officer? And you can't go to the police. And even if you go to a woman's shelter, the police know where those shelters are, the secret locations. Police know where they are because they have to take victims to them. So there's nowhere you can hide. And I thought that was that idea that sort of helplessness I wanted to sort of investigate.
But do you have to be, are you switched on with the antenna at certain periods of the writing cycle, or what is it?
I think, well, it's the nature of journalism. I mean, we're switched on all the time. When I was a journalist, I think, someone asked a question in the earlier session about why so many journalists become novelists, and now so many have become, crime writers. Quite a few in the room here. And the situation is, as a journalist, you're 24 hours a day, you're looking for a story, you're trying to find out, oh, that's a story. You can actually see a little thing saying, oh, if I interview someone about that, or, and look at a different way, there's a story there. And you're always searching for things. And as a novelist, I think the same thing happens. But I liken it to something Stephen King once said, that, he likened the writing process to walking along and seeing a bone sticking out of the ground. And you start brushing, you do your old, archaeologist trick, and you brush the dirt away. And you're hoping it's a dinosaur. And as a journalist, you're hoping it's a dinosaur. You're hoping you're uncovering this huge conspiracy, this huge thing that's going to make podcasts and novels and films, but oftentimes it's a dog bone. And you move on. So in a sense, it's a bit like that. I'm looking for those bones sticking out of the ground, hoping that I'm going to uncover a dinosaur, but often it's a dog bone.
Now, Michael, don't be afraid, but I'm going to do something with you I've never done at a writing session before. I'm going to test your brain here. And I'm going to propose a hypothetical to you. Okay. And I want to see how your brain deals with.
I had this thing about, I had a nightmare the other night. I got to tell you this. Hard quiz on the ABC. I had a nightmare. I went on hard quiz, and my specialist subjects were my novels, and I did not get a single question right.
You were shown the door.
Oh, yeah.
Ouch. Okay, so this is, just picture this. I'm going to give you two images, okay? And I want to see if you can work with this. So now picture a house or a flat, right? And the front door's wide open. Got it?
Yeah.
You're walking down the corridor, you come to a bedroom. Inside the room is a double bed, and on the bed is a man sitting on the side of the bed, weeping. And on the bed beside him is a beautiful wedding dress laid out across the entire top of the bed. Now, he's just found out his fiancée has been found murdered, okay? Image number two. We are now on a sheep farm in Western New South Wales. A man is herding sheep. He's on a quad bike. He's a retired homicide squad detective. Back in the homestead, there's a message on his phone asking him to ring Sydney's major crime squad urgently. Over to you.
Oh, no. You want me to write that? No. You know what
you're saying? What do you think? What's triggering in your brain? This was the point of the exercise.
Can I tell you what it reminds me of? And this, I'll get back to that. This is what I mean about giving myself time to think. No, I once had to do an event at a crime festival in the worst event, and this reminds me of that, by the way, Matthew. Good,
terrific.
The worst event of my entire career, and I was on stage with Jeff Lindsay, who wrote the Dexter books, and Mark Billingham and McBride, Stuart McBride. And Stuart McBride had come up with this great idea that there was a wheel that you spun, but initially they just handed this stack of photographs out and people had to just pick a photograph. And the photograph might be, for argument's sake, Scott Morrison, might be the first photograph. And the second one was a grand piano, picture of a grand piano. And then the wheel would be spun and it would come up and land on brothel. So you instantly had to come up with a plot of how to kill Scott Morrison with a grand piano in a brothel. And we had to that was the session. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. This is the second hardest thing. Okay. No, I mean, I think I'm thinking straight away suicide.
Not murder.
Oh no, but I think it's going to be made to look, it's murder, but it's made to look like suicide.
Right.
And he doesn't believe that she would have committed suicide on the day before a wedding. Mm. And the retired homicide detective will obviously, as any crime writer here will know, has got to have some personal relationship to either the victim or to the guy sitting on the bed. he's got to have a personal stake in that. It's got to potentially be either his daughter, and like he may well have been rounding up the sheep just before he goes and puts on his tux and flies the light plane to the wedding. You know, you've got to, there's got to be some personal involvement in this case that's going to mean he's going to come out of retirement and he has to prove or find the killer.
Nice. Yeah. I like that. Don't steal that idea, by the way.
But I can see Chris Hammer taking notes.
But you instantly joined in an underground way the characters. So we've got stories behind stories. You're instantly suggesting connections, and this will be revealed as we go through the book.
Yeah, and it's not easy for me because, as I said, I don't plot in advance. So really, a lot of people would take that story and plot the whole thing out before they started writing, whereas I would open with that scene and just let it unfold over the course of 12 months of writing. I wouldn't have any idea how it was.
What would you open with? Just describe it to me again.
What would I open with? Probably, you got to grab it. I mean, the great difference in crime writing now, compared to, let's say, in the days where P.D. James was writing or going all the way back. Someone like anyone who's read a P.D. James will realize that, you know, some of those books you'd go 200 pages before you discovered who was dead, who was going to die. And in this day and age, you cannot wait 200 pages, have a reader waiting 200 pages before you discover that. You have to grab them early, and the intrigue has to be early. And whether it be, I think potentially, I'd have a situation where initially maybe she's not dead, she's missing. You know, she didn't turn up at the church. She didn't turn up to get dressed for the church. He's come back. He was left standing at the altar and she wasn't there. And there's a disappearance or whatever. But, you know, and then that's probably the way I would start.
Nice. Sounds like a Michael Robotham book. That's fantastic. That was my intention, Michael, to get your brain. I could hear the cogs. Fantastic.
Grinding.
Describe for us what a writing day for Michael Robotham looks like.
I have what every great writer needs. I have a stay-at-home partner who does everything for me, and which is why people ask how I can manage to do a book a year. And I feel, and it's purely because that's all I have to worry about doing. I can write 7 days a week. I don't have to. But I mean, I write every day. I mean, I wrote this morning. You know, I wrote. It's what I do, and so every day is a writing day. Some better than others, but yeah. But it's I often write in cafes to get myself away from the internet, which is the greatest invention and the greatest waste of time ever invented. You know, and I can go deep down rabbit holes, and which is why I don't like the internet. You know, I can be researching whether you can tell whether a hair came from a dead person or a live person, which you can find out in about sort of 5 minutes online. God, it's a lot better than the old days when you used to have to find a pathologist and ring them up and get them to talk to you. Now you can find that out straight away. But literally 3 hours later, I could be on YouTube watching a college basketball game, and I don't even like college basketball. You know, it's just the rabbit holes I go to. Yeah.
But do you write on one particular laptop? Do you handwrite? Do you take notes? What
no,
do you do?
I write longhand initially.
An initial draft in longhand.
Well, I do. I just write the day's writing in longhand, and I might go 2 or 3 days just writing longhand, and then because my writing's so appallingly bad, I have to put that on a computer within 3 or 4 days. Otherwise, I'll never read it again. And so I'll then transfer that onto a computer. And then once that first draft is done, a lot of it's on computer. And then the final probably 6 rewrites are done on paper, where I just keep printing out the whole thing and just going through and polishing. Yeah.
And have you clearly, to be that disciplined, you will have developed a routine that works for you? So, you know, I was just reading the other day about Graham Greene and how he would, you know, someone pointed out, have you noticed how Graham Greene's novels are all pretty much the same length? Because he would write about the same number of words a day, I think 300 to 500. He'd write for 9 months, off it goes to the publisher, starts again.
God. No, it's funny, I have at home, because I said I wanted to be a writer since I was 12. I have in a filing cabinet at home this incredibly thick file, and it's got interviews with every writer, every famous writer you can imagine, including Graham Greene. And I cut those and I read them, and I would underline the passage that said that which way they faced their desk and what they had for breakfast and, what they drank. Because I just thought the more I read about, how Samuel Beckett did it, and how Brendan Behan did it, and how, if the more I read, I know so much now. I mean, Mark Twain used to get his wife to do all the housework naked because it inspired him. I did suggest that to Vivian. I have the bruises to prove it. No, so I know, Voltaire would get rid of guests by pretending to faint. I know all the weird stuff about all the writers because I would just study them, thinking that if I learned enough about them, I too could become one. And it's no secret, one of my favorite all-time books is A Movable Feast. And I remember when you were living in Paris, going to Paris to see you. And I remember using The Movable Feast, which is a posthumous memoir about his time as a young writer when he was trying to write his first novel in Paris. And I used as my tour guide. I went to the same bars. I went to the same bookshops. I just thought I could channel Hemingway and suddenly maybe could become a writer. Yeah. And so again, I discovered, you asked me my routine. All writers discover their own, really, and, it's pretty much, lots of coffee, do the cryptic crossword and then straight into work.
Well, in the new novel, I loved reading about London. I mean, you have obviously an enormous affection for that city, and I felt I was back there as you described it in the book, which was brilliant. It's a character on its own, isn't it? Just tell me about you and your relationship with London.
Yes, it's an interesting one. For a long while, even I obviously lived in London for 12 years. And when I lived in London, I remembered Australia incredibly vividly. And when I moved back to Australia, I remembered London very vividly. But for a while, as anyone that's read a lot of my books will know, I took my books out of London because I was frightened, because London has changed a lot. Whereas you go into those little villages out in the home counties and whatnot, and they don't change in 100 years. And so I took my books out of London because I was scared that the longer I lived, well, even though I went back a couple of times a year, I was losing touch, and I didn't want to finish up like an Elizabeth George figure who wrote about a London where, Dick Van Dyke had a Cockney accent almost. That sort of, their London was like a Americanized Disneyland London, not a real London. And so I was a little worried when I went back to London for this book, When You Were Mine. I did a lot of research because I was worried about whether I still had London right, because London has changed so dramatically and Brexit's going to change it again, and so I'm glad you said that about it, because I'm still slightly concerned about whether I'm getting the real London.
And of course, the book deals with domestic violence, but is there a topic you wouldn't write about?
Yeah, the torture of children, or I know a lot of my books have had there are stories about women or women in jeopardy, and I was once. It reminds me that I know there's a great debate tomorrow about killing animals in fiction or dogs in fiction. And I had a situation. I did an interview, Radio National interview, with the late great Peter Temple, and we were asked, actually, is there anywhere that's too dark, anywhere you would not go? And Peter Temple said that he would boil a baby and eat it with truffles, and that would be okay. But heaven help him if he ever harmed a family pet. So I tested that out in a book called Bleed For Me, where there is a dog, Gunsmoke, who suffers a terrible death. I shouldn't laugh. Don't laugh. I got death threats over that. I have had death threats over it. I have had so much hate mail over the death of this dog. People will actually write saying, I was enjoying your book up till then. And I will reply, so you enjoyed the bit about the abuse of the child discovering their dead father, all the stuff they enjoyed, but the dog was too much for you,
Name was Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke.
How did it die, just out of interest?
It was an arrow. It was, and it died slowly and horribly. Yeah. Sorry. You don't have to read that. Avoid that book if you love dogs. It's my mother rang me and abused me, and she said, dreadful scene with the dog. You have to change it. You have to change it. I said, why? I said, why? I said, no, it's dreadful. I spent the entire book thinking the cat was going to be next.
We're going to questions in a sec, but I just wanted to, there was a sentence in your acknowledgements that really caught my attention. And that was, you write this: it's a wonderful thing after 2 decades of writing fiction to come to the blank page with all the same excitement and wonders as when I penned the first chapters of The Suspect in 2001. With each subsequent novel, I have always strived to push myself as a writer using different tense, new voices, or dual narratives. And I just think that's brilliant that you've published now, what, 15, 16, and you're still trying to get it better. Yeah?
Yeah, no, and look, it's one of those issues, and anyone that's read a lot of crime fiction will know it. I mean, you'll pick up a book, and even though it's a well-known series, let's say, a crime writer that writes this long-running series, and you might love that main character, and it might feel like you have put on your favorite pair of slippers and got in your favorite armchair and you're back with an old friend. But you also realize when you finish it, oh, I enjoyed it. It was just enjoyable. But it was a bit like the last one. Do you know what I mean? That there's a sameness that develops to it. And I'm really trying so hard not to have that happen in my writing, which is why I do sort of standalones, like, you know, although I think there will be another book in this series now, there will be another book in Philomena. But it is that, it's a bit like the beauty of being a ghostwriter was I got to look at the world through a completely set of new eyes. You know, it's beauty of being a journalist was that each week or each day you're doing a new story. And I guess as a novelist, I just want to challenge myself and write. You know, this book was a female perspective. Again, another huge challenge to write from the point of view of a 26-year-old London policewoman. You know, I look at middle-aged, balding, graying, grumpy, bloody old man that I am. You know, I've got to try to look at the world through the eyes of a 26-year-old, you know, ambitious, you know, young policewoman. I mean, it's a real challenge.
We're going to questions. There are no mics, so please, if you wish to ask a question, just raise your hand and bellow. We'll have questions here and hopefully Zoom, and I'm hoping someone's asked about Gunsmoke. I'd love a question about the dog.
It's no questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we just need to repeat that. It's a question about ghostwriting and why you wouldn't, for example, go down the line of a more conventional biography, as opposed to a ghostwriter attempting to mimic, if you like, the voice of the subject.
Oh, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, and it's a situation. It's a bit like, okay, what would, when you look at reading nonfiction, what do you regard as being a more truthful form? Someone's autobiography or someone's biography, someone's interpretation of them or someone's interpretation of their own life. And now, saying that in terms of being a ghostwriter, the vast majority, I can tell you now, the vast majority of autobiographies aren't written by the subject. Because the simple fact of the matter is you might be a brilliant politician or a brilliant soldier or a brilliant sailor or a brilliant spin bowler. What does that mean you can write? You know, I mean, and how awful would it be? I don't know. Let's say you might be a huge fan of Wayne Bennett, you know, as a football coach. Why do we think Wayne Bennett would be a great writer? He might be a great league. And how disappointing would it be if you picked up his autobiography and it was him trying to write it, and it was just, you got nothing of the man, you know? So in a sense, as a ghostwriter, your job is to try to capture them on a canvas. So I was always very careful about, you know, that I wouldn't take a role in a project that was image management, that was just about them trying to massage. And it was, you know, and as we've seen classic examples in Australia, the primary one being Cheryl Kerno, if you failed to mention something in your autobiography, such as your affair with Gareth Evans, and within 24 hours of your book coming out, that is made public, that book will not sell a copy and it will be laughed out of the bookshop. So you're far better off, and I always used to tell people this, is be honest, put it all out there, because the one thing that the reader will appreciate is they appreciate honesty, and they appreciate if they see these people they might admire a lot that are willing to admit that they have failings, they have doubts, they are actually in the reader's esteem, they rise in their esteem, because they think, well, that's really, I'm impressed by their honesty there. So in that sense, that's why ghostwriters are used. And it's not just ghostwriters. Oftentimes it's brilliant editors. It may be someone's had a really good red hot go at writing their own autobiography, but they need a really good editor to come in and say, listen, that's self-indulgent twaddle, or this is really interesting, we need more of this. So books can either be lightly edited or really heavily edited. They can be partly ghostwritten, or they can be completely ghostwritten. But ultimately, oftentimes it's the only way you will see someone get an autobiography on the shelf, because not everyone can write.
I'll just repeat that question. Yep. So from a tactile reader in the audience who's also listened to audio books or Michael's audio books, the advent of the popularity indeed of audiobooks, has it altered the way that you approach the actual writing process?
No, not really. I mean, audiobook is the fastest growing area of the publishing market. It's astonishing, the growth in it. I adore audiobooks. I listen to loads of them. I love the fact that I get to choose the people that do my books, and they get to show me, they send me different they get these actors will read the opening chapter, and if I want to, I can go back and go, okay, can they read another chapter for me? And who doesn't love being read to? No, I think they're really important. It doesn't change the way I write. I have a feeling I think one of the reasons I've been successful in audio is because I write in the first person. It actually lends itself to being read really, really easily, because you just think you're listening to that character tell their story. I think the interesting thing is where I can slightly see, because I've had Secret She Keeps turned into a TV series, and they're just started filming the second series of that. And in the UK, as of October, I think they're just wrapping up filming of the Joe O'Loughlin series by World Productions, who made The Bodyguard and Line of Duty, who are making the Joe O'Loughlin series. And I find that, having been in the writing room for some of those, that it's funny, as I'm writing, it doesn't change the way I write, but you suddenly think to yourself as you're writing, oh, that's going to be expensive to shoot. Oh, they won't like that very much. It's almost like then, like you suddenly say, oh God, rainy days. They hate having to produce a rainy day. That's really expensive, and then it gets really silly. Then you smile at times as well, because you suddenly think, oh, they won't want to show that during bloody PG ratings. This is going to have to go later. But no, I mean, and it doesn't change the way I write, but I just find it just drifts into the back of my mind when you suddenly, because I've been in writing rooms where those factors are taken into account. They go, oh no, we couldn't possibly shoot at that location. Can we write around it? Yeah.
Yes. So will I just repeat that, sorry, briefly. There's an observation from a reader that your work in terms of primary characters has shifted from male to female centric.
To a degree it is. It didn't set out that way. It's funny, with The Secret She Keeps, it's a story about two women who are both pregnant, whose baby's due at the same time, and it's narrated by the two women. I mean, that was an idea I had for 20 odd years. The idea of, and it was, again, it was a great chat. But one of the things that corresponded with that book's success was you'd had this tremendous sort of success of things like Big Little Lies and female-led drama. I mean, pretty much dominated now. You can see so many of the dramas that are huge have been led by strong female characters. And I know I had an American publisher that said, oh, we would so love it if you wrote another story with a strong female character. Now, and to a degree, I have done that with film. I didn't do it just because of they asked me to. I find it a great challenge for me. Women are the great readers of fiction and crime fiction. People think it's a male-driven sort of genre. It's not, and probably I guarantee more than 50% of my readers are women. So it wasn't sort of conscious, but apart from, as I mentioned earlier, I want to challenge myself, and I'd done it once before with The Night Ferry, and I don't know whether I did it very well, where I wrote a book from a female point of view. And I still think I made a lot of mistakes in that book, and I wanted to do it to try again to see if I could capture the first person voice. And I expected a lot of pushback. I thought, we obviously have there was a lot of debate over cultural appropriation, and Craig Silvey, was a lot of flack over writing Honeybee in terms of taking on sort of the trans story. And to a degree, when I wrote The Secret She Keeps, about, it's a story about infertility and childlessness and these deeply female issues, I expected some pushback. I expected some people to come back and say, what right have you got to tackle those subjects, And to me, I always thought, my response would have been, in the end, I didn't get that, would have been that, how are we ever going to obtain true equality, if you don't allow a male writer to empathize so completely with a woman, to try to enter her skin and to look at the world through her eyes, how are we ever going to, because I would never say to a woman, oh, you can't do that for him, you can't do, no, you want, if I do it badly, criticize me, but don't tell me I can't give it a red hot go.
Will there be a book set in Australia, Michael?
That book on the bottom drawer might come out at some point.
God's Waiting Room. What about Gunsmoke? There could be a redeeming novel about Gunsmoke.
Look, I think there is. And it's not set in stone. It's just, it's not. I don't purposely set that original decision was to set it in the UK, and then I wrote a series, and so I don't sit there and think I wrote a piece. It's funny. I wrote a piece a week ago in a newspaper. Actually, it was published in the Sun Herald, and I did reveal a conversation I'd had with a senior publisher about more than 10 years ago now, who said to me that he would be happy if I set a book anywhere in the world except Australia, because he said there had been no internationally successful Australian crime novel in living memory. And I remember saying to him at the time, until there is. And of course, since then we've had, Leanne Moriarty and Jane Harper, and the most astonishing success. And so, but, publishers are funny creatures. They just think that, they don't want, every time I announce to a publisher that I'm going to write a standalone and go away from a successful series, they give you this fixed smile and they go, oh, that's nice. And you can sort of see and ticking in the back of their mind, sort of saying, oh, is this a good idea? But they can be great. Standalones can be great for a writer's career, but there are examples of writers who write very successful series, and the standalone is always when the sales drop off and people want the characters that they love.
We're out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael Robotham. Has been brilliant. And Michael will be signing around the corner at the front. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matt Condon.